Isabel, Allende, House of the Spirits, Part 17. Esteban Trueba dropped the carving implements on the tablecloth and ran out of the room and into the street, calling his sister's name into the night. There was no trace of her. Meanwhile, Clara ordered one of the servants to fetch their coats, and by the time that her husband returned, she was halfway into hers and holding the car keys in her hand. "Let's go to Father Antonio," she said. They rode in silence. Esteban was at the wheel. His heart contracted as they searched for Father Antonio's old church in the poor quarters of the city where he hadn't been in years. The priest was sewing a button on his threadbare cassock when they arrived with the news of Ferrula's death. "But that's impossible," he exclaimed. "I was with her 2 days ago, and she was in good spirits." "Please, Father, take us to her house," Clara begged, knowing, "I know what I'm saying. She's dead." At Clara's insistence, Father Antonio accompanied them. He led Esteban down one narrow street after another until they came to where Ferrula lived. Through all those years of solitude, she had lived in one of the tenements where she used to say the rosary against the wishes of its intended beneficiaries in the days of her youth. Esteban had to park the car several blocks away because the streets had grown narrower and narrower until there were only for bicycles and people on foot. They walked deeper into the neighborhood, avoiding the puddles of dirty water that overflowed from the gutters and dodging the piles of garbage in which cats were digging like silent shadows. The tenement was a long passageway of ruined houses, all exactly the same, small impoverished dwellings built of cement, each with a single door and 2 windows. They were painted in drab colors, and their peeling walls, half eaten by the damp, were linked across the narrow passageway by wires hung from side to side, which by day were used for laundry, but this late at night swung empty in the dark. In the center of the little alley there was a single fountain, which was the only source of water for all the families who lived there, and only 2 lanterns lit the way between the houses. Father Antonio greeted an old woman who was standing by the fountain, waiting for her pail to fill with the pathetic output of the faucet. "Have you seen Señorita Ferrula?" he asked her. "She should be in her house, Father. I haven't seen her these last few days," the old woman replied. Father Antonio pointed to one of the houses. It was just like all the others, sad and flayed and dirty, but there were 2 pots hanging by the door in which grew a few small tufts of geraniums, the flower of the poor. The priest knocked at the door. "Go on in," the old woman shouted from the fountain. "The señorita never locks her door. There's nothing to steal in there anyway." Esteban Trueba called his sister's name, but he didn't dare go in. Clara was the first one who went across the threshold. It was dark inside, and they were immediately met by the unmistakable aroma of lavender and lemon. Father Antonio lit a match. The weak flame cut a circle of light in the shadows, but before they could take a single step, the match went out. "Wait here," he said. "I know the house." He groped his way, and a moment later lit a candle. His figure stood out grotesquely, and his face, deformed by the light from below, floated halfway to the ceiling, while his giant shadow danced across the walls. Clara described the scene in her notebooks that bore witness to life in minute detail: the 2 dark rooms, their walls stained with damp, the small dirty bathroom without running water, the kitchen in which there were only a few crusts of bread and a jar with little tea in it. The rest of Ferrula's quarters seemed to Clara to fit precisely with the nightmare that had begun when her sister-in-law appeared in the dining room of the big house on the corner to say goodbye. It reminded her of a used clothing store or the dressing room of a struggling theater company. Hanging from a few nails on the walls were old dresses, feathers, boas, squalid bits of fur, imitation rhinestone necklaces, hats that had gone out of style 50 years before, stained petticoats and with threadbare lace, dresses that were once flashy and whose sheen had long since disappeared, inexplicable admirals' jackets and bishops' chasubles, all thrown together in grotesque fraternity in which the dust of years had made its nest. On the floor there was a jumble of satin clothes, Devantes, handbags, belts studded with fake stones, suspenders, and even the shining sword of a military cadet. She saw dreary wigs, pots of rouge, empty flasks, and an unruly collection of impossible objects scattered everywhere. A narrow door divided the only 2 rooms of the house. In the other room, Férula lay on the bed, festooned like an Austrian queen. She wore a moth-eaten velvet dress and petticoats of yellow taffeta. On her head, firmly jammed down around her ears, shone the incredible curly wig of an opera star. No one was with her. No one had known she was dying, and they calculated that she must have been dead for many hours, because the mice had already begun to nibble her feet and eat her fingers. She was magnificent in her queenly desolation, and on her face was an expression of sweetness and serenity she never had in her grievous life. She liked to wear used clothing that she bought in second-hand shops or picked from the garbage, explained Father Antonio. She would make herself up and put on these wigs, but she would never hurt a fly. On the contrary, until her last, she always said the rosary for the salvation of sinners. Leave me alone with her, Clara said firmly. The 2 men went out in the alleyway where neighbors were beginning to gather. Clara took off her white wool coat and rolled up her sleeves. She went up to her sister-in-law, gently removed the wig, and saw that she was nearly bald, aged, and helpless. She kissed her on the forehead, just as Férula had kissed her only a few hours earlier in her own dining room. And then she calmly proceeded to improvise the rites of the dead. She undressed her, washed her meticulously, soaping her without missing a single crevice, rubbed her with cologne, dusted her with powder, lovingly brushed her 4 remaining strands of hair, dressed her in the most eccentric and elegant rags that she could find, and put her soprano's wig back, returning to her in death the infinite attentions that Férula had given her in life. While she worked, fighting off her asthma, she told her about Blanca, who was a young lady now, about the twins, about the big house on the corner, and about the country. And if you only knew how much we missed you, Férula, how I've needed your help to look after the family. You know, I'm no good at domestic matters. The boys are terrible, but Blanca is a lovely child. And the hydrangeas that you planted with your own 2 hands in Tres Marias turned out beautiful. Some are blue because I put some copper coins in the fertilizer. It's a secret of nature. And every time I arrange them in a vase, I think of you, but I also think of you when there aren't any hydrangeas. I always think of you, Férula, because the truth is that since you left me, no one has ever loved me as you did. She finished arranging her, stayed a few minutes talking to her, caressing her, and finally called her in her husband and Father Antonio to make the burial arrangements. In a cookie tin, they found the unopened envelopes of money Esteban had sent her, his sister, once a month for all those years. Clara gave them to the priest for charitable works, sure that would be what Férula would have wanted. The priest stayed with the dead woman so that the mice wouldn't treat her disrespectfully. It was almost midnight when they left. Ferula's neighbors had gathered in the doorway to discuss the news of her death. Esteban and Clara had to make their way through the huddle of curious faces and shoo away the dogs that were sniffing among the crowd. Esteban walked quickly with his big strides, practically dragging Clara behind him, without noticing the dirty water that was splattering his impeccable gray trousers from the English tailor. He was furious because his sister, even now that she was dead, could still manage to make him feel guilty, just as she had when he was a boy. He recalled his childhood when she surrounded him with dark solicitude, wrapping him in debts of gratitude so huge that as long as he lived he would never be able to pay them back. Once again he felt a sense of indignity that had frequently tormented him when he was with her. He despised her spirit of sacrifice, her severity, her vocation of poverty, and her unshakable chastity, when she felt as reproach toward his own egotistical, sensual, power-hungry nature. Go to hell, bitch, he thought, refusing to admit even in the farthest corner of his heart that his wife had ceased belonging to him ever since he threw Ferula out of his house. Why did she have to live like this when she had more than enough money? He shouted. Because she didn't have anything else, Clara answered gently. During the months that they were separated, Blanca and Pedro exchanged burning letters, which he signed with a woman's name and which she hid as soon as they arrived. Nana managed to intercept one or two, but she didn't know how to read, and even if she would not have been able to break their secret code, fortunately for her, because her heart would not have withstood the shock. Blanca spent the winter knitting a sweater made of Scottish wool in her sewing class at school, with the boys' measurements in mind. At night, she slept with her arms around the sweater, inhaling the scent of the wool and dreaming that it was he who spent the night beside her. Pedro, meanwhile, spent his winter writing songs on the guitar that he would sing to Blanca and whittling her likeness on any scrap of wood he could lay his hands on, unable to separate his angelic memories of the girl from the storms that were raging in his blood, turning his bones, lowering his voice, and causing his hair to appear on his face. He was torn between the demands of his body, which was becoming that of a man, and the sweetness of a feeling that was still tinged with the innocent games of childhood. Both young people awaited the coming of summer with aching impatience. When finally it arrived, they met once again. The sweater Blanca had knit for Pedro didn't fit over his head because in the interweaving months he had left his childhood behind and acquired the dimensions of a man, and the tender songs he had composed now sounded ridiculous to her because she had a woman's bearing and a woman's needs. Pedro was still thin and still had stiff hair and sad eyes, but his voice had acquired a hoarse, passionate timbre that would one day make him famous when he would sing of the songs of the Revolution. He seldom spoke and was rough and awkward in his social dealings, but gentle and delicate with his hands. He had the long fingers of an artist which he used for whittling, for pulling laments from the strings of his guitar, and for drawing as early as he used them to hold the reins of a horse or to raise an axe, for chopping wood or to guide a plow. He was the only one in all Tres Marias who dared confront the patron, His father, Pedro Segunda, told him 1,000 times not to look Esteban in the eye, not to answer back, and not to argue with him, and in his desire to protect him, he had more than once given him a sound beating to knock some sense into his head. But his son was born a rebel. At the age of 10, he already knew as much as his teacher in the school of Tres Marias, and at 12 he, instead on making the trip into town to attend the high school there, rain or shine, he would leave his small brick house at 5 in the morning and by horse or by foot. He read and reread 1,000 times the magic books from Uncle Marcos's enchanted trunks, and continued to nourish himself with other volumes lent to him by the union organizers at the bar and by Father Jose Dulce Maria, who taught him how to cultivate his natural poetic gifts and to translate his ideas into songs. "My son, the Holy Church is on the right, but Jesus Christ was always on the left," he would say enigmatically between sips of the wine he used at Mass, which he served to celebrate Pedro's visits. And so it was that one day Esteban Trueba, who was resting on the terrace after lunch, heard the boy sing about a bunch of hens who had organized to defeat a fox, and called him over. "I want to hear that," he said. "Go on, sing." Pedro Tercero lovingly picked up his guitar, rested his foot on a chair, and began to strum. His eyes did not leave the patron's face, while his velvet voice rose passionately above the soporific air of the siesta. Esteban Trueba was no fool, and immediately understood the defiance. "So," he said, "the stupidest thing can be set to music. You'd be better off listening to learning love songs. I like this. In union there is strength, as Father Jose Dulce Maria says. If the hens can overcome the fox, what about human beings?" He picked up his guitar and shuffled out without giving Esteban time to think of anything to say, even though anger had reached his lips and the tension was rising. From that day on, Esteban Trueba kept his eye on him and did not trust him. He tried to prevent him from continuing his schooling and inventing all sorts of tasks for him to do. Men's work, but the boy simply rose earlier and went to sleep later in order to finish the work. That was the year Esteban whipped him before his father because he brought the new ideas that were circulating among the unionists in town. Ideas like Sundays off, a minimum wage, a retirement, health plans, maternity leave for women, elections without corruption, and most of all, a peasant organization that would confront the owners. That summer, when Blanca went to spend her vacation at Tres Marias, she almost failed to recognize him. He had grown 6 inches and had left behind the pot-bellied little boy with whom she had spent her childhood summers. She got down from the car, smoothed her skirt, and for the first time in her life did not run to meet him, but simply nodded her head in greeting, although her eyes told him what could not be said in front of everyone. And anyway, she had already told him in her unbridled letters in code. Nana watched it from the corner of her eye and laughed mockingly. When she walked in front of Pedro Tercero, she sneered at him. It's time you learned to stay with your own class instead of nosing around senoritas," she said between clenched teeth. That night, Blanca ate with the rest of the family in the dining room. They were served the chicken casserole that always welcomed them to Tres Marias, and she showed no sign of her usual restlessness during her extended after-dinner conversation, while her father sipped his cognac and talked about imported cows and gold mines. She waited for her mother to signal to her that she was excused. She then calmly got up, wished everyone good night, and went to her room. For the first time in her life, she locked it. She sat down in her bed without removing her clothes and waited until dark, until the twins' raucous shouts in the next room and the servants' footsteps had subsided, and the doors, the locks, and the whole house had been settled into sleep. Then she opened the window and jumped out, falling onto the hydrangeas bushes that her Aunt Farola had planted long ago. It was clear night, and she could hear the crickets and the frogs. She took a deep breath, and the air brought her the sweet scent of peaches that were drying in the courtyard to be used in preserves. She waited for her eyes to adjust to the darkness and then began to walk, but she was unable to continue because she heard the furious barking of the dogs that were left unleashed at night. They were 4 mastiffs that had been raised, tied to chains, and spent the day locked in a cage. She had never seen them up close, and she was sure they would not recognize her. For a moment she was swept by panic and about to scream, but then she remembered that old Pedro Garcia had once told her that the thieves never wear clothes so dogs will not attack them. Without a moment's hesitation, she pulled off her clothes as fast as she could, threw them over the arm, and continued walking calmly forward. Without a moment's hesitation, she pulled off her clothes as fast as she could, threw them over her arm, and continued walking calmly forward, praying that the animals wouldn't smell her fear. She saw them springing up, barking, and continued without losing rhythm. The dogs came closer, growling with suspicion, but she did not stop. One of them, bolder than the others, came close to sniff her. She felt his warm breath against her back, but she paid no attention. They continued to bark and growl for a long while, accompanied her part of the way, then, frustrated, went away. Blanca gave a sigh of relief and realized that she was covered from sweat or shaking. She had to lean against a tree to wait until the exhaustion and had turned and her knees to jelly passed. Then she quickly put her clothes on and ran toward the river. Pedro was waiting for her in the same place where they had met the summer before and where years earlier Esteban had stolen Pancha's humble virginity. When she saw him, Blanca blushed violently. During the months of separation, she had been toughened by the hard job of becoming a man. While she had been shut within the walls of her house and her convent school, preserved from the wear and tear of life, and nursed her romantic fantasies while she knit with Scottish wool, but the image of her dreams had nothing to do with this tall young man who was walking toward her, murmuring her name. Pedro reached out his hands and touched her neck by the ear. Blanca felt something hot run through her bones, loosening her limbs. She closed her eyes and surrendered to it. He pulled her gently toward him and wrapped his arms around her. She pressed her face against the chest of this man she did not know, so different from the scrawny boy whom she had exchanged such passionate caresses only months before. She inhaled his new scent, rubbed herself against his bristly skin, ran her hands over his lean, strong body, and felt a full, all-encompassing sense of peace that had nothing to do with the state of agitation she had taken possession of with him. They sought each other with their tongues as they always did, even though it seemed like a new invention, and fell kneeling as they kissed in desperation. Then they rolled onto the soft, damp bed of earth. They were discovering each other for the first time, and there was no need for words. The moon crossed the whole horizon, but they did not see it. They were too busy exploring their deepest intimacy, insatiably entering each other's skins. From that night on, Blanca and Pedro met every night at the same place, at the same time. By day, she embroidered, read, or painted insipid watercolors around the house, under Nana's approving glance, now that she could finally sleep in peace. But Clara sensed that something strange was going on because she could see a new color in her daughter's aura, and she felt sure she knew why. Pedro performed his usual tasks in the field and continued to go down into town to see his friends. By nightfall, he was dead with fatigue, but the idea of seeing Blanca gave him back his strength. It was not for nothing he was 15 years old. Thus the summer passed, and years later they would both recall those passionate nights at the happiest time of their lives. Meanwhile, Jamie and Nicholas used their vacations to do all the things they were forbidden in their British boarding school. They shouted until they were hoarse, fought at the slightest provocation, and came to resemble two filthy little urchins with scabby knees and heads full of lice, replete with warm, freshly picked fruit, sun, and freedom. They left early in the morning and came home at sundown, spending their days hunting rabbits with their slingshots, riding horseback until they were worn out, and spying on women who were washing their clothes down by the river. And so 3 years went by, until the earthquake changed things, and after that vacation, the twins returned to the city ahead of the rest of the family, accompanied by Nana, the city servants, and most of the baggage.